Months?
Yes, we do.
We should probably either take it out of last call and put
So
it back in last call.
it's basically waiting for an uploaded replacement draft, and then it's good to go. Just resolving the last call responses.
It just looks weird having it in last call.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get to it. It'll probably be, we're good. I have been following up on that.
Okay, so he is leaving because everybody.
All right, people, it's time.
He wants to be employed, and it's kind of complicated.
Yes, we're in the dark, dismal corner. Hello, welcome to JMAP/Extra at IETF 116. All the things that it says on the slide. Not only is the session being recorded, but at least for those of us in the room, we can see some text scrolling down. Yeah, the text is picking it up, but for those of us in the room, we can see the text being transcribed on our screen in real time, and the kind of accuracy that I'm sure will only get better over time. Anyway, welcome. We have all the usual slides, starting with the note well. If you have not read this already, then please do. It will tell you all about your rights, responsibilities, and correct behavior, which I'm sure, hello. Everyone will be lovely and respectful, and we will work very well through the large number of things we have to discuss over the next couple of hours. Meeting tips, you probably, if you've already worked out how to get here, you know this. Masks are still required at this meeting if you're in the room and not busy eating food or speaking at a microphone. Speaking of which, if I take this off, how much clearer is that? I might keep it off while I'm speaking. Excellent. So this is the rough shape of our agenda. It changed slightly. We added an extra 5 minutes to extra, leaving 10 minutes for other business. What's happened here? Unstable connection to server. Fantastic. I don't know if my arrow keys will work anymore at this stage. Anyway, so we've got this little intro at the start. We have around about the first hour for JMAP, around about the second hour for extra, and then we'll squash in some milestones and other business at the end. Okay, I'm just going to refresh my connection because I can't drive the slides at the moment. Sorry for this random technical issue. Yeah. Pop up and say hello.
Yeah, hi, this is Hans-Jörg speaking. So this probably won't earn me brownie points, but I have an organizational observation. So I wanted to point somebody to the extra slides. And so, and it happened to be several times I went to the extra data tracker page.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the last IETF meeting tracked there is like 5 years ago.
Yep.
And sorry. And finally, I found out that the slides are actually in the JMAP thingy. So I think it's okay, but it would probably be great if there's at least a pointer or so in the extra repository.
Yeah, I'll have to pass it on to the secretariat because I don't know what's going on with all of that. But
because also, you know, people might think that there's no work going on in extra or something like that.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's extra work going on.
Hey. All right, I'm just doing the dance. And I'm back. And here we are at the agenda for JMAP. Now, is there any agenda bashing before we get started on the JMAP section? Anything anyone would like to add, change, edit here? Give you a moment. So both blob and quotas, as far as I know, unless Murray has anything different to say, they're with RFC editor in the editor queue. They're good to go. I don't think we have that, just noting that they are still in progress. Calendars and contacts. Have we got Anil here? I think we're expecting Anil to potentially show up. Yes, we have. As far as I know, they're just on hold at the moment. Neil.
Hello. Yes, I did have a few slides for
All right.
are we just agenda flashing at the moment, or are we actually starting?
No, we're done. We're on the JMAP agenda now. So
Right. Okay. Cool.
go ahead. Would you like to
Well-
share them, or do you want me to pop them up for you?
Yeah, if you could pop them up, that'd be great. There's just a couple. So
Yeah.
So the short status is calendars. We think is nearly done. I have there's been a excuse me, new draft since last time. If you go to the next slide, please. So the main change is that first one, which we discussed at the last meeting, which is moving the calendar preferences as a whole data type and just having this as default properties on calendar and participant identity, and a way of setting that still ensures there's only one at most that is default. Now, there's been a bit of discussion on the list about that. If anyone has any further thoughts, please either step up now or do reply on the list. But I'm hopeful that that is basically okay. And yes, the plan with the calendar stuff is to wait until we have JX calendar bits ready to go at the same time, and then we'll do those together. Marco?
Hi, this is Joris speaking. So yeah, so I was part of the discussion on the list about the calendar preferences object. So the discussion JMAP mail has a role property for the folder object, the mailbox, which defines several types. And in calendars, the idea is to not have that and to only have a default calendar folder or not. And the whole discussion was about, do we need more than that? Is it extensible enough? Maybe. In summary, my point of view here is that I would prefer to have more roles here, more types of folders, but I don't have a strong opinion on that. So it seems like there is a strong incentive on only using the isDefault. So that's fine for me. So the idea here was, if you have if you have like auto-generated birthdays or similar, or auto-generated other anniversaries, or I don't remember my other examples, then this will be a property in the event instead. So it will then say, oh, this is auto-generated, and not on the folder. So
I think that makes sense.
I don't have a strong opinion on that.
Multiple different ones. You could have multiple different ones in the same calendar, like anniversaries and birthdays, or anything like that, and so it tells you on an event basis. But Hans-Jörg?
Yes, this is Hans-Jörg. I have a strong opinion on this. And so from a data portability perspective, there's quite some systems actually which do have these auto-generated folders in a way, and you typically want to handle them special in a way, because otherwise you might even cause duplicates on the destination, and so on and so on and so on. And I'm not convinced of so much that this will be solved, or it makes things certainly complicated if this only happens on an item base, because these auto-generated things, like for instance from anniversaries, which many systems do, it's basically each and every item in that folder for which this applies to. So I would find it more clean and more in line with existing systems if there would be something like a special use property on those calendar folders. A role property, I think it was role property.
How is that exposed in existing systems? Do they actually say this is an anniversaries calendar or birthdays? Or something like that?
So what we do in existing systems, so in existing systems currently this is not to be distinguished. So what we do basically is we apply heuristics based on the folder name. So we know actually in a critical path system, a folder or a calendar called birthdays or anniversaries is actually an auto-populated folder, and so we skip this folder for migration if we know that in the destination system a similar folder will be automatically created as well, because otherwise user will be confused because there would be two of those folders, the one migrated from the legacy system, which is no more in sync with that, destination system, and the destination system will for itself generate such a folder from the contacts where basically this is drawn from in parallel, for instance.
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely think this is kind of orthogonal to is default. It's kind of a separate thing. I wonder whether we want something like is auto-generated or generated from or something like that to say this calendar is something.
Yeah, so what I'm currently out of comfort zone, because I would actually need to look deeper into the what this is related to actually is also things probably like shared folders. There might be all kind of special cases sometimes, where you have something in the user's folder visible, which is not actually created explicitly by the user. So this anniversary by example is just a very specific one. I probably might to look again. My strong gut feeling is that such mechanism might also prove useful in additional cases, actually, without being able to point out one directly.
Well, if you could perhaps follow up on the list then, like later with more examples, when you've had time to like go back and look at it a bit more, I think that'd be really helpful. I think that was where it got to in the thread. I asked like, what are the current things do? What do we actually need to be able to represent here?
Yeah.
And then we can come to a conclusion on that. Okay, cool. Thank you. I think, yes, that's kind of the main thing to be resolved, and we've got a bit of time as JS calendar base is a little way off, but hopefully we can get that resolved and still get this published later this year, not too much later, hopefully. If we go on to the next slide, just briefly, is sharing. We said last time we were going to take this to last call and publish it. I didn't get around to that for various reasons, but I've been looking at that this week, just fixing up the editorial bits, and I'm hoping to take that last call after this meeting. Robert.
Hi, this is Robert Stepanek speaking. I only have one remark for default alerts that I would like to discuss, but I'm not sure if this is the last slide of the deck. So before we... This
is the last slide of this, so yep.
Okay. So I just have a small thing. I recently implemented default alerts, and the JMAP calendar spec currently defines that for if an event is in multiple calendars, you use the default alerts set on all calendars where that event is in, which makes sense to me. The thing is, the spec also currently says you take all of them as I read the spec. And I do wonder if we should allow some leeway for the implementation to decide that, for example, two default alerts in different calendars on the same event that have the same trigger and the same action might actually not trigger twice.
Yep,
but of course,
that's a good point. Yeah, can you email me afterwards or raise a GitHub ticket or something? We'll discuss that further.
Okay.
Yeah, I might propose there if you had UUID on the alerts and they had the same UUID, then suppress them and the server could actually combine them and give them the same ID, potentially.
Yes. Yeah. So the spec already says that default alert IDs, JMAP IDs, must be unique across all calendars. So there is already, this already is actually built in, but you still might have two alerts with different IDs that are basically the same in terms of semantics.
Okay. So you've been adding support for event being in multiple calendars, I presume. Oh, let's go.
No, actually, I haven't yet, but it's something that occurred to me that we might need to think of.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. All right. Okay. Thanks. Martin.
Yeah, Tom.
Hello, my name is Martin Durst. Are we still on JS Calendar or are we on something else now?
Still on JS Calendar.
Question.
Yes, we are still on JS calendar.
Ah, sorry, then, okay.
All right, the next slide, though, I believe is on sharing, which we may as well do now as well.
Yeah, so that I was just saying before, I think I got a bit ahead of myself. I meant to just take this to last call and publish it after the last meeting, and I didn't get around to it because I need to fix up the section references and stuff. I've just been doing that this week, so I'm hoping I'm going to give it a last read through and then publish a new version. Hopefully that can go to last call tomorrow.
All right, did anyone have anything else they want to say on sharing before we move on? Or on JS calendar that we missed? It's called Jazz calendar according to the auto text. Right.
Cool.
From now on, everyone must do jazz hands.
Jazz calendar, I think, is definitely. JMAP Civ is next. Hello, Ken.
Hello. You can go to the next slide. I think there's just one, maybe two tabs.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the only change that I made since 115 was there was a request to add a on success deactivate script argument for symmetry with the activate script. So you'd use this in lieu of a null argument to activate script to deactivate a script. And if you want to actually change the active script from one to the other, you actually need to use both of these arguments. But pretty simple change in the text. And if there's no issues there, I think we're pretty much ready for last call because I think the rest of the protocol is pretty fully baked. Hans-Jörg.
Hi, Ken. This is Hans-Jörg. I've just a small note. I think we shortly talked about that previously. So I'll have a talk later on in the extra session about CIF rule handling and so on. And there might be some considerations that might be given to JMAP CIF here. I probably won't even explain by now because anyway, there's a talk later if this doesn't totally confuse everyone, but just as a future pointer, okay?
Sure.
That made perfect sense, I think.
Any other discussion on this new argument that I added? All right, thanks. Guess we're done.
Cool. Thanks, Ken. According to the agenda, the next thing is S-MIME sender. Alexia, I believe you don't have slides for that. Come on up.
Yes, I'm slowly walking through my to-do list by adding. So I have a prototype version for automatic decryption now. I will need probably Neil to double check that. And I think I have an open issue whether I need extension to the query method to search for this sort of thing, so which might be potentially useful.
Mm-hmm.
As in find all encrypted messages. So progress, I think I will be done next time.
Cool.
Or at least, next time Neil can tell me how wrong I am and how I want to do it. But I will be conceptually done. Whether the draft reflects how it should be done, that's another question.
Cool. All right. Next, I think we're way ahead of time. We had quite a lot more time allocated for all of this, so we are currently already at JMAP tasks.
So can I share slides or?
Yep, you can share the slides if you, or you can request slide control, I think.
I click this button now. This is the first time I'm doing this.
Yeah, so I can tick grant.
And now I can go this way.
And back.
Yep. There you go.
All right. So, hi, I'm Joris. Presenting on JMAP Task first. And yeah, so I released a new version 6, with a bunch of changes. First, the reminder I do every IETF. We want this to be a common standard, not only for groupware systems, but also for Kanban boards and issue trackers. That's one of the special things about this spec here. Yeah, so what's new in the newest version? I had some feedback on the IETF116 and in CalConnect. I worked, not all of that in, but most of that in, I would say. So first I restructured the person object to align with a JS Contact author object. JS Contact has a notes. So the idea, the feedback was we have comments and checklists and maybe a bunch of other properties that are connected to a certain entity. And JS Contact has something similar. JS Contact has notes on a contact, which is connected to a certain entity. So I basically used person to reflect that entity, which is already defined in JMAP calendars and also in JMAP tasks, and use that as the aligned it with the JS Contact author object, which was previously done, or which is like fresh work done by Robert. Yeah, I didn't want to go into much more detail here because you will see in the next few slides. Then I also added a comments property, which uses that author and which basically reflects adding comments on tasks. And I added a checklist property, so a task list can contain a checklist with single check items, which I will go into more detail now. Okay, so checklists. At last IETF, I had some slides on how to do that. Try to have a discussion here, and I decided on using a single checklist object and not link relations. That was the alternative I presented last time. So I decided for an actual object because it's a very simple way, and it provides a simple way to specify what properties should actually be supported by items in a checklist, because typically you don't want to have all of the items, all of the properties of a task for an item in a checklist. And it's easier to handle. Sometimes if you use link relations, you could end up, a task could end up referencing something that's non-existent, and you would need to handle that somehow. And it might even be more efficient, but not sure if that's a very good reason. Yeah, so we now have a checklist object and a checklist in tasks. Yeah, and future work. So those are the changes I did, not a lot. But yeah, the newest JMAP calendars just presented by Neil. Now also did some changes to the person object, and that came after a small discussion I had with Neil about how to do this. So I need to reuse what he did and basically apply it to JMAP tasks. So if anybody wants to leave some feedback on that, probably best to reply on the list here, because the draft doesn't currently reflect how it's been done in JMAP calendars. I will publish a new version soon with that. So the idea in JMAP calendars is that a person object that's currently used in a notification there will have 3 different ways how it's connected to a certain entity. So either it's a simple email address that the UI can then use to look up certain details of a person, or it's an actual principal ID, or it's something that identifies a participant of the underlying, typically of the underlying data format. So the participant here is something that's from the data format, JS calendar, and person is basically a layer on top. It's in the API. It also uses, well, theoretically, can use the principal to identify information about a person. Yeah. So I need to use that in checklist and comments. And therefore, I will also then make checklists and comments an API properties of the JMAP API and not of the underlying data format, because the person object is also used only in the API. It cannot be used in the underlying data format. Yeah, so that's a very specific idea I have currently for restructuring the way I use person in tasks. If there are any comments on what I just presented, feel free to get into the queue. If not, I will then wait. Huh? No, the button doesn't appear. Can you? No. Go to the next slide. Oh, there is a comment.
Hello, there's someone in the queue. I'm afraid I can't read your name, but please do hop up.
Just a quick question. Does the email address also support internationalized scripts?
Sorry, I didn't get it. Could you repeat?
Does the simple email address mentioned here will include also internationalized email addresses, scripts beyond Latin?
Yeah, it's just a normal string. There's no restrictions on the character set.
Is that Amharic? Yeah.
Could you identify yourself, please?
So, I'm the Saleng Hwala.
Okay. Need to unlock my phone every time. Okay, so yeah. So future work in general. For the next IETF, restructure the document regarding the person object, what I just presented. Continue the survey regarding, so I have a tasks system survey. I presented a bunch of IETFs ago now. I need to finalize that regarding folders to make sure we support all the various systems here. And also continue the survey regarding time zones and localizations. That's on my to-do list. And then finalize the folders and gather some more feedback from vendors. And then it should be done. So it's actually not a very long way until the spec is done here, I would assume. Any more last questions?
Been very quiet, hasn't it? This whole session. Thanks for all the work on this. I know this has been a long running project to collect all the info. So I'm glad it's getting close to completion now. And I believe we're now on to the new work, which is JMAP for portability. So who's presenting that one?
Maybe I need to walk around the microphone.
Okay.
Hi.
Did you send slides on that, or are they on?
I'm Joris.
There it is.
Yes, it's migration and portability. Yeah.
Woohoo.
All right. Yes, this is some new work that's not adopted right now.
You may need to request. Yep.
Yes. So JMAP for migration and data portability. I think we teased that 2 times already. And now we finally have a spec. Yeah, let me start here. So first, an overview about the spec. So the motivation here is we want to use JMAP to move existing data between different systems over a generic API. And for example, this can be due to the Digital Markets Act, Article 6, or maybe other data portability related requirements, or yeah, just projects, different use cases. So we want to have an API spec that we can just give to vendors of legacy systems which currently do not have an appropriate API for certain data types. And additionally, we want to combine the JMAP spec with additional solutions or extensions for migration and portability related issues that we observed. Yeah, so that's currently the scope of the spec, which is open for discussion if that makes sense to put it all in a single spec. You will see soon. I have quite a lot. I think this is quite a long talk, so let's see. You don't need to jump in right ahead if you have questions, but feel free to do so. So, yes, our observations on RFC 8620 is it's really nice that it's feature rich. It's really nice that it's generic, so we can use it for migrations. But it's sadly a bit complex because it has so many features. And it's unclear to, a feedback that we also got is that it's unclear how to implement only parts of the spec and still be RFC 8620 compliant. So in the end, that's my take on that. This results in RFC 8620 having a high entry barrier and high requirements currently, which is not so nice for current adoption. And this is where we come in with the spec to help. So the idea here is to give a guide on how to quick start JMAP. Have simple guidance on the bare minimum for a one-time migration use case, so we have a lower entry barrier. Yeah, so in more detail, what did we do? What's in the spec? First, in the session resource, the session resource can be reflected by a JSON having merely constant values for a lot of portability use cases, actually. And the idea is to focus only on key objects, methods, and properties defined by JMAP core for the migration use case here. And also, the idea right now is to have a minimal version of JMAP first defined, have very minimal additional use cases that add more implementation effort on top of the minimal version of JMAP. For example, what we leave out is here no query for some use cases, so the query method can be left out in some cases, or typically there is no need to implement methods like copy or changes in a first iteration implementation. Other things we left out is batching, support for push, and so on. So yeah, this might be somewhat controversial. I'm really excited to hear some feedback on that. I will go into more detail. So, and the second thing we put in the spec is to introduce a simplified request scheme. I forgot to say, currently the spec is supposed to be an informational spec. It's supposed to be guidance on how to implement RFC 8620. But it also introduces a simplified request scheme. So the requirements are even lower for certain ancient legacy implementations, or so the entry barrier is even lower for certain use cases. Doesn't matter how old the implementation is, actually. So on the third thing that's also in there, I also already teased, is extensions for further migration-related problems. Which are supposed to improve portability even further. That's one thing I'm going to talk about at the very end. So, focusing on key objects, methods, and properties. So the idea here is to document how to implement RFC 8620 in a minimal way, the first, and then define additional steps for common use cases. Common use cases are data export, data import, typically. Data export can optionally have listing and paging, which is currently all required by, or not, I wouldn't say required, but it's typically all listed in RFC 8620, just as is. And some use cases require additional attachment support, some don't. And also we have some more advanced features of JMAP core in a separate section. For example, core echo is a really useful method for connection testing, which we recommend, but which is not part of a minimal implementation, I would say. Yeah, and most important, this should be simple. So we provide developers a simple overview what they need to implement, and we have a hopefully nice overview table that can more or less be used as a scope statement for a new project manager that wants to implement JMAP, and then he can directly see, oh, this is what I need to tell my developers. And this is what it looks like. There's an excerpt from the table that that's in the spec right now. So in the columns, on the left column, you can see the JMAP core feature of the spec. Here it's a core echo method or the get method, the whole request, the get method response, and then the properties, separate properties of request and response listed as a single line. And export use cases. Exporting is one very important use case for portability. Importing is one important use case for portability. And then there are some more advanced things like core echo. And basically what we right now did is, what do I actually need? I don't really need, at a minimal implementation, I don't really need core echo for importing or exporting. But for exporting, I need to get my data out of the system, so I need the get method. I need to implement the whole request. So I'm in the second line now, but I don't necessarily need the properties method, which has some more advanced features. So this is then displayed with a minus. And for importing, I don't really need to get out all the data, don't need the get method, but I need the set method, which you can see below here in the line. Yeah, so this is the current spec. And I already got some feedback on the list on that, that this is not really conformant with the current RFC 8620. So, and the idea here was, instead of just omitting certain things or recommending to omit certain things, one should reply with an error message in some cases saying, hey, I don't support this. Or sometimes this is actually something I added as a more or less a workaround for supporting the full spec. Sometimes things can be just implemented as a constant value. So this is what I'm going to present on. So it's like the next iteration of the spec. That's not currently what's in there, but that comes from the discussion on the mailing list. Merely omitting certain features is forbidden, like I just said, and use constant values or error responses instead of just omitting, as I just said. So, for example, how can we do that? For example, a state or a session state could just be an empty string. If there's no need to resync, then just have it in the response, have it in the session object, but make it an empty string. Don't leave it out. It's required by the spec. Also, the download URL, if you don't have attachments, have it in empty string. If there are no multiple accounts in a system, just have the account ID set to self, and there's only one account ID. The username for logging in then is sufficient enough. Or for example, errors, that's the constant value I was talking about. Error messages, for examples for error messages are if one client tries to use core echo, then reply with a server fail error. Say, oh, I don't know this method. Server fail, yeah, is a very generic error, but it's the most fitting in this case that I could come up with. If it's a GET request and you don't implement that, then reply with request too large, because you set max objects in GET to 0. You don't allow any objects in your GET request. As you can see, this is really obvious sometimes. And then for a set, if you don't implement set, reply with account read-only error, because you set account read-only to true. This took me quite some time to figure out which error to respond in which case. So yeah, one of the big questions is, does it make sense like this? Or does it even make more sense to have it as a separate thing that's not fully conformant to RFC 8620? But I will have that question somewhere. Maybe Nick, just shortly, this is like an extension slide, and then I can take your question. So this is in more detail what this looks like. This is the same table, basically revised version. But this time I actually changed the columns, so try not to be confused. On the left-hand side now it's JMAP minimum implementation. What do you need as a bare minimum that actually doesn't have any features, so it doesn't support GET or SET or whatever. And then what do you need to add if you want to add a certain feature, like I want to export my data, I want to import my data. So as you see, a minimal implementation basically just here for the methods just returns error responses all the time. If you want to export data, you need to implement the GET method. And you cannot just leave out the properties, like below IDs. There's a properties property. You cannot just leave that out. Please give an error response instead if something's in there, but you don't support it. And those exclamation, or those, what is that? Quotations are, it's the same as the JMAP minimum implementation. Might be a bit confusing here, but so for import, you don't need to do anything additional for GET, but you need to add additional, you need more additional implementation effort for a set. So, whew, I hope everybody was following. Neil has a question. He was following somehow, at least.
Hello, Neil Jenkins.
Hi.
For the transcript. Yeah, it was less of a question. Just I think this approach kind of makes sense, just because this means that if you've got some library that implements JMAP, it should just work with this. Like I know we've had a problem before with a Rust implementation that had very strict like checking of responses and properties. So if you omitted something, it would fail because it would go, well, that's required in the spec. It's not come back in this response, and just kind of panic the whole thing. So I think that's the big benefit here. And if we're going to, if it says it's JMAP, it needs to conform to RFC 8620. Otherwise, it's not, and you kind of got a forking, which is a bit weird. I mean, it's still going to be painful if you try to use this for anything other than the very basic export import cases you're going for. But I think there is still a disadvantage of saying yes, it does conform to the standards. So if you have a library that supports JMAP, it should just work with this.
Yeah, good feedback. So I, just quickly, I actually have one more slide, I think, on having it as a separate thing or having it as a having it as a part of RFC, or having it conformant to RFC 8620. Wait, let me see. Yeah, that would be the slide. So if you have a comment regarding that, it might make sense to wait for that, but feel free to comment now.
Can I comment now?
Yes.
Okay. This is Hans-Jörg speaking. So I just wanted to give two things. So first, a little bit of context, maybe just edit how we came to this. So I think it's important to understand for everybody, we as our use case is really migration. So we never had the intention, or maybe we have in the future somehow, to use JMAP as it is designed for as an interoperability protocol to build a client that continuously acts on behalf of a user with the server. But we found actually our use case is portability or migration, however you phrase that. And the clear overlap is, of course, the data objects are there. Yeah, so that was tempting for us, of course, because we were searching for quite a long time for a standard API we can, especially in case of legacy systems, give vendors to support, so we can easily copy over the data from the legacy system somewhere else. So sometimes this is why there is a distinction between import and export, because we typically, in these situations, these systems will only it's a legacy system, so they will just implement export, obviously, because the system will be dead afterwards. Huh? And clearly what this points out is from a protocol level, of course, first of all, these vendors we cooperate with or we help migrate we cannot tell them implement JMAP, because they will say, are you crazy? Why should we implement batching or something like that? It's just not required for that use case, because the difference between data portability or migration and interoperability or full-fledged protocol is that you just don't, have certain use cases like changing stuff or so on, because the data will be copied out once and again, and that's it. And the same happens also on our side. So for the client, we are a client, obviously, in that case, or man in the middle, because we read from the source, write to a destination, which might be or might not be JMAP also. So also we don't basically implement all of JMAP for that. So you find all the nice JMAP libraries we produced so far are a little bit incomplete in the end, which is fine. It's open source. Everybody can complement to it. And so we brought this, as Joris said, to the IETF of London. And I think, so the idea was it would be helpful to document this in some way, must not even be an RFC or so. I think there was some discussion on that in London, that it might be helpful to have a spec. That's why we are here. So just that everybody knows in that case. Second remark, very shortly. So this gets back now to this error thing. So obviously in the very much case I now described, actually it's also kind of pointless for a legacy vendor to tell them to implement some of the methods with an error, because actually in the migration scenario, we as a client will ensure we are the only client for that legacy system, so we will never call any of these methods, and it's totally pointless to make a dummy implementation even just with the error. Said that, there might be other data portability use cases. Let's say you want to have that as a data portability solution on a live system, which is not decommissioned afterwards. So if you think about something like the data portability project or something like that, goes a little bit in that direction. There, of course, it could well make sense, because there people could also use that. Let's say they have a mobile client with JMAP and want to use that in order to exert their right of data portability and get data out of the system. So I agree that for that case, actually, it's perfectly fine and a good idea to have these error messages. It would probably not make sense in that one-off migration scenario.
So just to clarify, so this is not, you're not voting for either option. So you're not saying it's better to have this spec be conformant with RFC 8620, or you having it as a separate version of JMAP?
I did not. So I think one needs, I mean, in a way, anyway, a legacy system which uses this for offboarding won't be afraid if it cannot itself label compliant to the spec. So they can just leave it out. Might make sense to have a footnote in a spec that explicitly says that, so at least the developers are not super confused when we give them the spec and they say, okay, there is this thing. It's not this is not something we need to decide right now, probably.
Okay.
Q Marcel. I would like to say that I agree with your
what's the word, approach to this, with returning errors that they mostly seem to make sense. Do you have a slight gripe with the internal error for core echo when that's not implemented? Because that wouldn't necessarily, without further context, that's a really unhelpful error. It kind of suggests something greater has gone wrong than this just isn't an available service. But I think sticking to what the spec says is a useful goal, because then libraries won't have to start adding in edge cases for different variations on the spec when, that causes that tends to cause problems later down the road. All the other errors you've suggested seem to make relative sense, but maybe more research required on the just internal error.
That is a really great feedback. That shows me, because I also have that on the next slide somehow, and it shows me that people were actually following what I said. So let me just, if it's okay, there's Braun is in the queue.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's the argument for not requiring core echo even in the most basic of basic servers? It is literally the simplest possible thing you can do. Why would you consider a server to be compliant if it can't do core echo? It's just return the thing that you've just been given back down the wire.
It's just I try to leave out as much as I can, irrespective of how much implementation effort it would be.
Yeah,
that's something I didn't look into yet.
I think core echo is probably the one that you could say you have to have, because that is the way that anyone tests that a server exists and that it's talking JMAP. So
you mean?
Yeah. So say core echo, even if you're the absolute minimal JMAP server, you should do that.
Yeah. So you mean before instead of returning very generic, weird error messages, it's better to just say how implement that's required even for a minimal.
You must do that even for the most minimal server.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good feedback. So lost the control of the slides again. It's not as easy as I expected. Okay. So yeah. So this is just some more information on that. So as we already just talked about, only for core echo, query, and copy. Right now, the only error I found that was fitting is server fail, which is basically defined as an unexpected or unknown error, but not having query implemented, and then people calling it should certainly be expected, I would say. So it's not a perfect thing to use. Similarly, if I use, sometimes for queries limit property, for some properties, the only fitting error message I found was invalid arguments. It's a valid property. It's defined in RFC 8620, so calling it invalid might also be kind of confusing. So this error approach, I'm not sure if it's the perfect solution. Maybe we would need to extend JMAP core a bit with new error messages to have like something not implemented, or I'm not sure. But certainly I would say it's not perfect as it is, or I was just maybe unable to find a fitting error message. So if anybody has feedback on that, feel free to say it now or jump on the list. Also, additional thing, constant values. Download URL, having it as just an empty string makes sense to me, and also for a developer, if he reads that, oh, it's not implemented, but it's defined in RFC 8620 as it must contain variables, and an empty string doesn't really contain variables, so might also not be perfect. Yeah. So that's basically the questions that we just discussed. Is it flexible? Is JMAP core flexible enough? Do we want to put this in a separate, do we want to have a separate capability? Maybe I call this now core essential portability instead of JMAP core. But judging from the discussion here and from the discussion on the list, I would say the preferred way is to have something that's conformant to the current RFC. Maybe we want to extend it with some new error messages. yeah, here and there. So if there are any last comments on that, that would be nice. If not, I'm going to present on how we do the session object. How's the timing, by the way?
We're pretty much at the end of the time we had allocated for JMAP. So we're over time for this, but we had plenty more. So I'm okay with keeping rolling.
Thank you.
For another 6 minutes.
Sorry for having such a long talk.
Hi, Jim Fenton. I think the way that I would think of this is this is kind of a profile of JMAP for a particular application. So I would kind of document it that way. I think I agree with the sense that there are some implementations that are very strict, and therefore you want to not violate the spec, but sort of having particular, for this application, like for data portability and so forth, to have a profile, I think would be a very useful document to have as at least informational, maybe even standards track.
So you're saying that we don't necessarily need to extend the core spec with new error messages if it's only a profile.
Right.
Okay. Thank you for the feedback. So, session objects, maybe I'm just trying to be a bit faster, or more efficient. Yeah, so as I said, in some use cases, you can have it as just a simple JSON. There are some restrictions. Restrictions for that are a single user login is tied to a single JMAP account. It's a one-to-one mapping. Also, accessing shared data is not required. So no getting, no setting shared data, because you would need the account ID for that. Also, the capabilities and restrictions, for example, max mailboxes per mail, URL properties like download URL, are the same for every user. If you have all those three, which typically a lot of portability use cases have, then you can just use account ID as self and return username and state as an empty string. And here's an example, basically, of a session resource object on that. So yeah, that's the minimal version that you can have. Max size upload to 0, no concurrent uploads, no calls. Maximum calls and request is 1, so no batching. I'm just going through the properties of the core, JMAP core here. No get supported, no max objects in get is 0, no set supported, max objects in set is 0, no algorithm supported. Is read only is true on the account, further down below, things like that. Okay. I'm just gonna continue. Now that's the essential profile, basically. Now the simplified request scheme is also part of the spec. Not sure. So basically here the idea is we add a new capability that adds a new way to address or to use the API, a new API URL, which is basically which removes the need to consume the JSON that comes in. So there's no more JSON in the request, only a JSON in the response, and then you would put all the stuff that you need inside the URI. This is still work in progress somehow. You can see first idea here. The question I have is, does it make sense to put this in a spec, in the same spec? Because it's probably, yeah, it's an informational spec.
Neil?
I would say once you've done that, it's not really JMAP anymore. Like it's, you unless you're implementing the other bit as well, in which case, why even have this? Unless the standard API exchange is either extra work because you're implementing it twice, or if you're just implementing that and not the standard API mechanism, then yeah, it's not JMAP anymore.
So, okay. More feedback.
Q myself again. I can see vaguely your reasoning behind doing this. I think it should probably be in its own spec if you do go ahead with it. It seems disjoint enough from what's previously been discussed that it could be used in other scenarios. So probably its own spec document would be useful, and then people can choose to implement one or both or neither.
All right. Thank you.
I've got.
Yeah. Go.
Yeah, Jim, Jim Fenton again. Not being that familiar with what's in the request property, is there anything there that is a secret, like a token? That are there security properties involved? Because it's generally not a great thing to do to put secrets into the URI where they're likely to be logged by web things.
Not really secrets, I would say, but yeah, that's one downside I didn't notice. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to say there was an idea that I've been playing around with for a while, which was to create a REST mapping for JMAP objects. So you advertise a REST URI and say under here /object, and then use REST style rather than JMAP style queries to access it, which might map more to what you want there, but the IDs parameters still, I guess you're fetching multiple IDs at the same time, so it's some kind of multi-get thing potentially.
So you wouldn't support IDs then, like a single ID?
Well, yeah, it'd be a single ID and as a path. And if you wanted to request multiple things, you'd do something like HTTP2 query where you're fetching multiple URLs in a single stream. So do that rather than having it be JMAP-ish at all, but still fetch the JSON objects that JMAP is, but with an explicit path per object. And so your query would be some kind of a get on the top level or a post to the top level that returns a JSON object that then has links to each of the individual objects that you would fetch via an explicit path. So I think that might be a better solution than this potentially. But either way, I would say you definitely want to do, if you're doing a spec, it's not an informational spec. It would be a proposed standard as all the other JMAP specs are, because it's not informational. It's here's how you do a thing.
Thank you. All right. Second, only 2 slides left. This is currently in the appendix because I also, don't think it fits in an informational spec. We included JMAP debug capability, a new one. The idea is here to supply log messages along the usual data exchange instead of sending them through a separate channel. So then you can just have a JMAP request and just use the capability debug, and then you get logs in addition to the usual reply, irrespective of what you used as a method. An example use case is if you have a JMAP API server running on a third-party infrastructure and you cannot access its logs, then you can just use the same channel. So I would say I don't need to ask the question. It should not be in the same spec. Similar for the second extension. That's currently inside the appendix of the spec. Somewhere we have the JMAP backend info. The idea quickly here is that some server software doesn't properly follow the core RFC. And if you have a client and you want to support such a server software, you need to identify somehow the server-side software. How do you do that? Typically by error-prone means, such as hard-coding URIs that do weird things. And the idea here is to extend JMAP to provide some backend info so clients can more easily identify faulty servers. That should be it, if I'm correct. I guess so. So the question now is, what do I do with those extensions and with the informational spec? Then I have to the room.
Okay, this is Santiago again. Just a very small context to those last two things. So I made the distinction prior. There is actually a data portability, two use cases. A very constrained one where there is a legacy server which is shut down, whatever. There is a situation you might use it in a data portability live, ongoing kind of setting. So these two last ones are very particular dealing with these legacy situations. So especially the debug one might be look very weird for many of you in a way, but it makes very much sense in that legacy thing, because you might end up with an ISP who has some legacy platform. There is no more access to that platform, no way to log out something somewhere, and we give them an API spec for JMAP, they implement the JMAP thing, and they cannot give us logs if anything fails. So that was basically the idea, to create a back channel to our system where we can see where something broke in their mapping from their database to JMAP. So I agree, it's a little bit weird, probably. However, we thought we also mention it here because there might also be use cases like, you know, in settings where somebody is implementing JMAP from scratch for some system where this might be handy in some situations, whatever. But just to help you understand a little bit what this is about. Another final thing here, what we discovered. So I told you earlier, our main use case is data portability migration. That's not 100% true because there is Linagora's T-Mail mobile client implementation for JMAP Mail, and we recently started developing a little bit for fun JMAP calendar and contact support in here, partially because we have this portability implementation, for instance, for Roundcube webmail, and there's currently no way you can sync Roundcube webmail address books or calendars with a mobile phone. So we thought that could actually be, you know, a nice extension here. And we actually found out that for this very particular use case of, for instance, syncing contacts, this minimal API, which we also use for migration, is actually also quite sufficient to do actually probably a simple sync app, because, you know, contact data is not so voluminous typically, so that you need something like, you know, fancy batching and kind of stuff. You can even circumvent update by doing a dirty delete and create thing. So this is a little bit more to get you thinking that this kind of profile might even be interested in certain scenarios to have really maybe you know, an easier entry barrier for adoption of even interoperability clients. I'm not saying this is necessarily a good idea. I totally agree if somebody is not so happy with that, but personally also think that could be something like a, you know, incremental path into, you know, more deep JMAP support at a later point, if you have really an easy quick start where you can have a very simple implementation which already brings you value.
Cool. I think we're probably going to have to close this off at this point because we're about 15 minutes over where the JMAP session was supposed to end. Thank you. Thanks for presenting it. Yeah. I gave them rope. All right. Back here on the slides. Okay, a bit of a dance to.
Can I ask one last thing?
Yeah.
So, how do we proceed with adoption or not? I'm not sure about the process here.
Yep.
Do we ask that at the end?
Yeah. If you want to ask for a call for adoption on any particular document, there, I think there was we've already decided maybe to split it into some separate documents. So maybe publish those, and then we'll do a call for adoption on each one.
On the list. All right. Thank you.
Can you remind me, do we change meet echoes now to extra, or do we all stay in JMAP?
No, we just stay right
Okay.
here. Annoyingly, the data tracker doesn't do a good job of linking them up. That was the question that was raised right at the start, that this doesn't show up in the extra list. Even though it's
Maybe in the notes for extra, put a pointer.
Yeah.
So at least that way it's discoverable after the fact.
Yeah. All right. So back on the chair slides again. Yes. He's present but only listed as a participant because they didn't add him as a chair in the system. I'm sorry. You're very welcome to pop up on screen. He's not here in person. I don't believe at this meeting. All right. So here is the agenda for extra. Do we have any agenda bashing for this one? I know. So Murray has requested to speak to the Civ Action Registry, which is one of the existing drafts at RFC Editor.
It's not. I think that's the whole. It didn't quite get there.
Yeah.
Howdy. So Civ Action Registry is ready to depart the IESG for the editor queue with one issue. It was shepherded for proposed standard. The data tracker says it's proposed standard. It was last call at proposed standard. The document says informational. Which one did you want? Once we resolve that, it's on its way. I don't know off the top of my head what which one the working group intended.
As an editor, I don't really care. I think informational is fine, and it's less work for me just to update the shepherd. Somebody else does.
You have to edit one of two documents. You're either going to edit the shepherd write-up,
Yeah,
or you're going to have to document.
I don't need to do anything.
Okay.
However, if I don't really remember why we decided it, whether it's basically informationals can create IAN registries, which is fine.
Yes, I mean, frankly, because everything points to proposed standard and was last call to proposed standard. Your choice. I'm going to approve either one.
We kind of disagreed with Braun. So Braun.
Yeah. I mean, can it just be passed to the editor with a request to update it to proposed standard in the header, so we don't have to actually publish a new draft that says nothing else? Or proposed standard makes sense to me.
I can probably do that, but you shouldn't like.
What's wrong? Repeat. What's wrong with posting another draft?
Yeah.
Repeat.
Yeah.
On the mic.
Barry wants to know what's wrong with posting a new version of the draft that says proposed standard in it.
They're cheap.
Yeah. Alexi, it'll take 3 seconds.
Now it will take less time to update the shepherding write-up, but okay, I can do that.
Okay.
If that's the way people want to do.
I think that
was the question.
I think that's the right approach.
So as soon as you do that, Eric will clear. I'll send it on its way. Thank you.
Okay. All
Thanks,
right.
Lexi.
Okay. I suppose I should stay for the rest.
All right. Yep. Message limit and UID only.
Message limit. I thought I was nearly done, and then I forgot that I volunteered myself to experiment with extra search keys, and I forgot to do that. So I'll need to do that next time. But I think it's pretty much ready. It should be done before next IETF.
Cool. And UID only.
That was recently adopted. There were comments from you, Braun, and from Arndt, which I think I incorporated. To be honest, I don't even remember if there are any open issues.
I don't think so.
I would like to do a bit more experimentation with implementations. But as far as the text is concerned, it's kind of done. So there are no, well, okay, other than probably missing security considerations, which I should really write something about. But other than that, module anything unforeseen discovered during playing with this, I think it's kind of done.
All right. According to this, I think that was all that we had from you. Thanks, Alexi. Civ process IMIP and Civ snooze. Ken.
Do you have the slides there, Brian?
Yeah, I can pop them up.
Thank you. So you can skip the next slide. So we've got this implemented at Fastmail, and we had a customer not too long ago file a ticket that said they had an appointment, I think it was from a dentist or a doctor, that they expected to be properly put on their calendar and wanted to know why it wasn't. And when we took a look at the data, it's because it wasn't actually an IMIP message. There was no request property in the data. And I'm assuming there's probably other automated systems that send these things out that aren't IMIP. They're just event attachments, like flight reservations, that kind of stuff. And this seems like the type of use case that we would want to support with such a method. So we discussed it internally, and if we add an option to allow non-IMAP messages to be processed, the name of the action process IMAP does no longer seem appropriate. So my question to the group, and I suppose I should probably take this to the list, is do we want to rename this to something more appropriate if we're going to handle non-IMAP messages? And then the second question would be, do we want to just add an argument that would allow this new method to handle such things, or do we want to, for lack of a better term, do some more heavy lifting on re-architecting the method, which I've got one possible proposal on the next slide if you want to move forward, Bron. Do we want to take, currently process IMAP has all the intrinsic work buried inside of it, where the implementation has to go through the various MIME parts to find the calendar attachment. Do we want to separate that out and use something like IRC 5703, which allows the scriptwriter to handle these things as they wish? So in this particular case, I've got an example where you could split out handling of requests and replies differently by having the script do the parsing as opposed to just the action doing it with a bunch of arguments. I don't know how people feel about re-engineering this thing at this point versus just adding another argument and renaming the method. Any opinions from the room? Neil,
go ahead.
I'd probably lean towards making it simpler and just possibly renaming it, adding an extra argument. If like the other concern with something like this is often there's like two copies of the iCalendar attached. Outlook compatibility, one is an IMAP and one is something I can't remember details.
Yeah, Microsoft does like application calendar or something versus text calendar.
Yeah. So I don't know whether, if it's just a single command, then you can have any logic for dealing with that as well built into the command, and you don't have to specify it in the civ, which might start to get complicated.
Yeah, agreed. And the biggest downside of leveraging 5703 is I don't know how many implementations are even out there. Cyrus doesn't implement this, and requiring somebody who just wants to support doing stuff with calendars to implement this might be too heavy of a lift. Alexei.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with Neil that for simplicity, I mean, internally you can still map your civ action to, internal little civ script you interpret, or call all the same methods to find the body part, but I think probably a single method with parameters seems to be simpler for end users, especially if they're going to do it by hand, or even using a tool. As far as renaming the method, we just had the SML BOF, right? Where we were talking about structured email and flight plans, and this is not quite ready. So I suppose I'm trying to say that it depends whether you want to be done and just say this is just for IMAP messages, or whether you want to wait and make it more readily available for other structured emails. And I don't think there is a right or wrong. It's kind of the question of timing and.
Yeah, I think I want to leave this.
I don't think I will be. Yeah, I don't think I will be heartbroken if we end up with having two actions which look similar, but one just for IMAP and the other one maybe for structured emails. Or we can wait and have a single action. I don't.
Yeah,
I think it's a bit of Mike said. I don't mind either way.
Yeah, I see your point, but this is really focused just on calendar data, and the only difference being sometimes people send stuff out without a method property. So it's other than that, you're basically treating everything else the same way.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think calling it process iCalendar or process calendar is probably the correct name rather than update cal. We're processing the calendar attachment, and I think using the full word calendar rather than cal probably makes sense as well. A bit of extra length for clarity is good. And again, I agree, we should be doing that rather than parsing the MIME structure in the sieve. I think that's going to be a real pain.
Fair enough.
Santiago, agree with that particular point as well. And also to the question of Alexis, so also see this is sort of very related probably in a way, but I see to structured email. However, I see it's worthwhile to pursue this in front of it and maybe even in parallel, because I think given, we have identified even the list of things we discussed today in structured email as being like, we should focus on a few things of those. We didn't even come to what that does mean to CIF. So I don't see that CIF extension for structured mail anytime soon, while this is, I think, something that could be very helpful quite quickly.
So you're suggesting finish this one
right
for just
exactly. Yes, this is totally fine. I totally support what is being done here, and I see it's related and overlapping to a certain extent, but we don't know yet what comes out of structured email anyway. So it would be a shame to, I don't know, block to wait.
Yeah. And I mean, like in the past, we've done actions which are similar to each other. We kind of already crossed this bridge. I don't think it should be trying to minimize the number of actions available is not necessarily a goal at this point.
All right, this sounds like we have all the answers you need, Ken. Is that everything you wanted?
Yes, I will update the draft with a new action name and a new argument to handle non-IMIP attachments.
Perfect, thank you. And now you have
CIF snooze. So the only outstanding issue here was, you can go to the next slide. Pete was not happy with mandating of a special type mailbox. So I added some hand-wavy text, which basically left the implementation, left the mechanics of how this is going to happen, implementation specific, but made the recommendation that this could be done with the mailbox as previously proposed. The big key here was Ned was adamant that the message must be accessible in some way, shape, or form to the user while it's snoozed. The original draft stated that something like future delivery could be used to implement this, but Ned didn't feel that was safe enough for the end user because the message could be out in the ether and the user would have no idea it was even there. And I see Pete says if I go lowercase, we're good. Okay. Any other comments, Pete? I think you're in the room, right? If that's your only comment, then I am perfectly happy to make that change and perhaps take this to the last call.
It's Pete Resnick, just getting up to the mic to say, no, that's fine. And I think Ned's comment about that goes with my idea of we shouldn't have an implementation imperative for how this might happen, because putting it in some hidden mailbox has the effect of hiding it from the user. So however a server wants to implement this is fine. But yeah, the reason to lowercase that may is it's not a protocol option. It's just saying that that's some way you might want to implement that.
Yep, right. Thanks, Pete. All right, I will post a update with this text. And well, actually, this text is already in the base one, but I'll make Pete's suggested change and then take it to the list for last call. Or
Great.
the chairs will do that.
All right, back on the agenda. We're up to the new work section, and I know we've got JMAP access first. So, Arndt, are you here? Do not see an Arndt in the list. All right. Art wasn't sure if he would be able to be awake for this or not, since it's the middle of the night for him. JMAP access is basically a way for an IMAP connection to say, you can also get this same data over here via JMAP. We pretty much believe it's ready to go. And yeah, the draft needs some updates. But the main thing is we'd love to have some implementation experience with it before actually putting it in as a permanent document. So please implement. I think that's pretty much everything that Arndt wanted to say on that. Let's move on. Maybe if he shows up towards the end, we'll come back to it. So Ken, you're back.
Oh, yes. You can go to the next slide, Bron. I think I mentioned this back in London, or maybe as far back as Philadelphia. This is something that you've got in the cyber server for a while. I'm not sure when Bron implemented it, but it's been there for a while.
10 years ago, easy.
Okay, fair enough. So this is just another list return option where you can request annotation data along with the list command, like we have done with status and my rights and other things. So just wondering if there's interest in bringing this into the working group as a working group document and then moving forward with it.
All right, Alexi, once you get the button. Just, we don't really need the buttons, just speak.
I want to be on the, yeah. That seems sensible. I mean, almost makes me wonder why we didn't try the document that anything can go into list return option. No, I'm kind of half joking, but I think this makes sense, especially if it's implemented, and the way you've done it seems sensible, and having some examples if people want to do this sort of thing too, so that they do it consistently, is a good idea. So so yeah, let's do that.
Cool.
Obviously,
So
this is a
we'll
question you need to take. You need to take it to the list, correct, Ron?
Yeah, we'll just do a call for adoption on the list, I think.
Cool. Thank
Anyone
you.
else have anything to say about it first? No. Thanks, Ken. All right, next on our list is IMAP in progress. Do I have slides for that? Yes, Marco, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm Marco Bettini from Dovecot team of Open Exchange. And we're going to this proposal based on some issues we had with customers. Basically, the topic is we have IMAP comments which are large, take a long time, and there are both clients and users that get upset by this behavior because they don't know what's going on. So on one side, this can cause disconnects of the clients that can be sorted out with Keep Alive, but also we have users that in the end open calls, and because they don't know why that command didn't complete in their expectation, basically. So this is the problem. Next slide, please. Thank you. So working on that, we realized that there is no formal way for the clients to know what the server is doing, and so they cannot present anything to the user in a standard way. That's why we are proposing this new response code. Next, please. So this response code has 3 fields. The first is the command tag of the command that originated the progress notification. The second one is a counter that says how many things have been processed so far. And the third is the goal we want to reach. These are expressed as raw numbers. So that the expectation is that in most cases, these will be message counts. There will be comments where this will be something else, but the idea is that this is what's going on. And next, please.
Yep.
So the idea is we want to send raw counts rather than percentages or something like that, because they are useful in multiple ways. The client can perform the division and present the percentage of progress anyway, but you can also have multiple comments, say, on different folders or even on different IMAP accounts progressing together, and you can put all the counts together and give a consolidated percentage of a complex operation that the client is performing on behalf of the user. Also, since the client can keep track of when it receives the updates, it can also present something like a message rate. So I'm processing, say, 500 messages per second or whatever. This can be useful in cases where we don't know the goal because it's not easy to pre-compute, but the user can have anyway an idea of if that rate of progress can be good or bad for him. Next. Problems. The command tags can contain the closing square bracket, which is not good for response codes. Our first idea was simply to avoid to refer the command tag in the progress if it's tainted. Another way could be to replace the closed square bracket with I think a plus, but it's not even in the draft I wrote because it's a more complicated solution. That character is not used in the tags, but anyway, we would lose the point to have the same value easily matchable from the implementations. As I mentioned before, the idea is that if the goal cannot be computed easily because maybe the implementation works in streaming or some kind of behavior that makes hard to find the goal number beforehand, the idea is that we can send anyway just the count so that the client can provide a partial information, not with a true, progress bar, but there is still some information that can be used in any case. That's the idea. Thank you for listening, and I'm open for comments.
All right. Do we have any comments on this? I have some comments, but I'll let other people go first. Alexi.
You can be first.
Oh, okay, fine. I love it. Thank you. This looks really good. I'm now wondering whether there needs to be some way for clients to ask the server to stop processing the current command, but that's a whole different topic and probably much more complex. Maybe if you want to stop it at the moment, pretty much all you can do is drop the connection. There's no way to say, please stop processing this. About the command tags, I think there's quite a few cases now where this comes up. E-search responses, that kind of thing, already have tags in them. But we've had a lot of cases where we want to put a tag in one of these responses, and we basically have to say, don't do that. Don't put trailing square brackets in your tags. I would love if we just updated. Did we do that in IMAP 4 Rev 2? Say you must not stick that in tags? We should have.
The problem there is that even if you update, all clients would be upset by that.
Does anyone actually use those?
Well, that's a question. If it's just allowed by syntax, but nobody is actually using it because it's slightly insane anyway.
Yeah.
Unless somebody decided it was really cute for whatever reason, then maybe we'll just add text saying,
Yeah.
Look, don't use these. You cannot use them with this mechanism.
Yeah, I think
that's probably okay as a limitation.
In that case, it's either you don't emit these things at all, or you just emit the basic one that doesn't have the command tag in it. The other pieces, I think there probably needs to be something in security considerations, advising clients not to trust that total's not zero and get a divide by zero error and crash, because I can imagine that happening. And I think there probably
I will certainly write a text for that, you know.
Yeah.
Just to be malicious, you know, server too.
And there probably needs to be something that says that both the total and the goal can change in both positive and negative directions, that there's no requirement that the server doesn't either increase or reduce the total as it continues to process, because I can imagine that going both ways. If you're sorting through a large number of mailboxes and it turns out that some have changed number of messages since you first calculated, and that your progress might go in reverse as well. For example, if a mailbox was deleted halfway through a large search, you might remove it from the pool.
At the moment, in the draft, I specified that the goal should be nil when unknown, same for the count, if that is the case. That is a side. There is a very side case where you can send just in progress without the numbers, and that it's simply a keep alive, but a formalized way to send a keep alive instead of just sending an entire resource.
I think anyway, it's more that clients need to not assume that those numbers say the goal will be unchanging for the entire time of the command, or that the progress will always increase or always stay the same. It could go negative as well. I think just putting some text in there.
For now, in the document, I specified that the server should not change the value of goal between the updates. I don't know if that should be a must. But,
no, absolutely.
It is also in the direction.
Yeah. Alexei?
Yeah, all good points. And yeah, we probably should, if we decide to adopt it, then this should be addressed.
Yeah.
We discuss. In general, I quite liking this a lot as well. We had some ad hoc stuff like just using human readable text saying that, with this information. So having actually a structured field for this using response code is a good idea. So yeah, +1 to adopt this.
This is Pete Resnick. I'm fine adopting this, but as written, and I've only just read it literally like 2 seconds ago, I completely disagree with Bron on this. This is horrible from a client perspective. Those numbers have to be consistently increasing. This has to be requested by the client. It can't just be unsolicited crap that comes back from some commands and not others. This has to be a capability. This has to be a capability asked for by the client.
Why?
Because clients can't reliably act on this if it's just random stuff. I can't put this in my UI if I don't know whether or not I'm going to get it. If I want a UI that's reliable in a client, I have to be able to say, does this server support command progress? I have to ask for it, and I have to get back reliable data from it. This is, as written, another, I can come up with some crap as a server, but that's not useful to the client. I think this is a bad idea as constructed. If you don't have reliable data that the client can depend on and give to the user in a way that is clear.
With my chair hat on, do you support adopting this document and
absolutely, absolutely? Now, I think the functionality provided by this is fabulous and needed and desirable, but the way it's currently constructed, I think, makes it easy for the server and really hard for the client, which is the consistent problem with IMAP every time a new feature comes out.
Thanks, Pete.
Hi, this is Hans-Jörg. Hi, Marcus. Thanks. I also appreciate that and support that work. I also second a little bit what Pete's comments. I think this should probably be a capability. I disagree a little bit with Pete in terms of probably the count should be able to change, because I can envision scenarios where server cannot reliably count in the beginning and might update a count. Just because, for instance, different item types are there and it's more easy to count them initially just by taking a file count and later on analyzing what's actually a message, these kind of things. And I have two more notes that came to my mind. So first question is, or I'm not sure if this is a thing, but I could imagine there is a security issue here in terms of actually the server is exposing sort of internal information or behavior. So I wonder if this could be leveraged by attackers in terms to find out, how a server could be stressed in a more particular way. I'm not sure if this is a good argument, because you could still do so by just usual commands, but this gives you extra information probably on, how stressed the server is for a certain moment. But other people might be much more educated to answer this question. I'm sorry?
This will be over tier list. So
Still, I don't know if this hacked accounts or something like that. I don't know. I'm just, you can ignore the point if it's not considered relevant. And my second point is actually, so I wonder a little bit, thinking about the HTTP API session yesterday, how this also might relate to something like throttling. Yeah. So as far as I know, there is currently no such structured way to notify throttling to a client. So especially if, I think there is sometimes in error messages somehow, but this is still something also a client needs to parse. And I see a relation, throttling. So throttling is when, when the server has rate limits on sorry? Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I understand the word. I want to explanation what exactly.
You got more people.
Sorry. Yeah.
Give me an example how throttling might look like.
So throttling is, for instance, if the server says one single user is only allowed to, let's say, retrieve one message per second or something like that, or do search requests, has a quota on search requests. Gmail does it, for instance. And you can do, I think in DAFCAT you can also do that. So this might influence actually also the speed. If you want to compute the speed, obviously, if throttling plays a role, that might, I don't know, something one need to think about. And I overall see here, this is in the same ballpark as actually informing a client about how a server behaves. So I think this could be somehow an additional or related information. But yeah.
Okay, I think throttling, we might need to think about it, that this might be a separate thing. Yeah. Again, like from fetches is, I'm writing a client that pipelines heavily. I don't actually, like, if the server will start rejecting my second fetch because it's in the same pipeline, I think that's silly. I'm not actually asking for specific speed from the server. I'm just asking that my fetch will be satisfied. If the server wants to slow down how it sends it to me, that's completely fine. So, there might be some interesting issues there. If it's what I can think of probably more interesting is if you start running multiple searches in parallel and server decides that, no, this is too many searches, I don't want to allow for that. But then the server can say, well, I'll reject the second, third, whatever. Again, I think we probably need to discuss, and there might be a capability way of discovering this and how this might look like. So maybe let's have a chat on the mailing list, and maybe we'll write a separate draft. Whether it will be the same thing or not, I don't know yet. All right. So I'm hearing pretty strong support for doing a call for adoption on the list for this. Thanks, Marco. And I think we probably should move on at this point to civ filter rule metadata. Yep, just loading them now.
Nice. All right. Hello, everybody. I'll try to keep it short. So this runs back actually a year ago to lunch BOF at the Vienna IETF, and I finally found some time to write this down. And yeah, you'll see what it's about. So probably everybody in the room roughly knows CIF as a mail filtering language. We had it already in some of the previous drafts. There is managed CIF as a HTTP-based protocol to let users manage those scripts. Next slide, please. So the question now is, how is CIF actually used in the wild? And there might be some statements here one could challenge, but this is basically based on personal observation in a certain way and or informed observation. But I'm happy to discuss also part of that later on maybe. So typically usage like CIF is typically explained as like what I call here direct usage, which I think is like you directly actually edit the so-called CIF script where all your rules are defined in CIF script language. You either do that on your local file system or your service file system where your CIF file is stored, or as there is managed CIF. Managed CIF actually gives you a way to obtain the file from the server and edit it with whatever client or editor you have and send it back. In order to do so, you need to understand CIF language. Understanding CIF language probably is nothing what the average internet user is capable to do, I would argue. I personally am not aware of any managed CIF-based third-party external client which is really end-user friendly, but I'm super happy to learn if there is any. All the ones I know, for instance, the standard Thunderbird managed CIF extension which exists, CHCIF I think it is, basically offers you a wide open input box where basically the full script is inside. So this is for experts, I would say. Yeah. So then what do I see in practice? There is also a lot of CIF, which actually is somehow created by users, but not via directly accessing the file, not via managed CIF, but actually by a user interface within their webmail UI. Yeah? And this is what I call here filter editing user interfaces. So these UIs don't allow you to edit the whole CIF script, but they give you something like a drop-down list where you can select like from, you can enter an email address, you can select from a list of supported actions, filter into or file into, sorry, and you can browse a folder basically. I think all of you probably have seen such kind of stuff. There is a related case which I call here indirect creations. This is basically some systems offer you in your inbox. You do a right click on a mail and you can say put this user on an allow list. Quite often this actually triggers in the background or will be stored within a CIF rule. In a similar fashion, there is what I call here special use filters. So for instance, in your webmail UI, you might have a feature to set a vacation notice, to set an auto forward, or to mark something spam. That's probably more related to the first one here. And these typically or can optionally be mapped. That depends very much on the system, but CIF is a mechanism which those systems actually use to realize this functionality. Actually, when you then visit the actual CIF user interface, again, within the webmail system, you are basically usually not able to edit this rule. So they are either hidden or disabled, so special use rules. Because obviously the system doesn't want you to fiddle around with the special use rules, because if you would be allowed to do so, you would basically break the vacation notice in some way. So overall, I would say this indirect usage scenario, which has different facets, as I just pointed out, is, I would argue, probably the most used part of CIF in the wild when it comes to user-based CIF scripts. But yeah, it's at least used to a very large extent. We won't argue if there's more CIF scripts otherwise, but yeah. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry. Next. No?
Yeah, I'm not responding. Hang on.
Ah, okay.
Good.
Okay, thank you. So how does it work in practice, actually? So that's quite interesting. So these CIF scripts created by UIs and by these special use CIF rules actually are distinct or look different, let's put it that way, from those CIF scripts edited by expert users. So I've never seen so far, and I've seen quite a number of systems with these end user CIF rules that they use else or else if, but they are rather very modularized. Yeah? So each of these rules typically are separate from each other, so there's no else if kind of stuff. But it's basically a rule and then typically a stop or something like that, which makes pretty much sense because it somehow matches with the UI paradigm, because you can have multiple rules underneath each other. Furthermore, these rules typically are not very deeply nested, because in those UIs, UI developers didn't take much of an effort to allow you a 5 times nested rule thing. So typically what you can do is an all of, any of, and then tests underneath or tests on the top level, and that's it. Furthermore, those modular rules have something like a name typically, which is displayed in the webmail user interface, and the CIF spec actually gives no place for that name. Yeah, so there is no way in the spec where actually vendors could store that. The same applies for the type. So how do vendors know that a certain rule which they store is actually that rule for the vacation notice or for the order forward? For the vacation notice, you could argue they can identify by the CIF test, but or CIF action, sorry. But for other special use rules, that would not be possible. And also the order sometimes is something they want to store separately. So what do? We have that in a second. Yeah, they do use it in header comments. Yeah? So they do comments in their CIF script, and there is a pattern where they say in comment name, key value is that is a rule name, and that is what they parse when they fill their webmail user interface and when they write back. Second aspect is actually deactivation of those modular rules. So in these UIs, you have those 20 filters. You can enable, disable them. Something that CIF by itself doesn't really support. There is support for multiple CIF scripts when you have managed CIF. Some of the systems do that. They move this modular rule to the other CIF script. Others actually just comment out individual rules within the larger script of those modular scripts. And some even do wrapping. So they just, once you click disable, they will update the CIF rule on the back end in an all or false, and then the other test statement to make sure they don't trigger. And they show this as disabled in the UI. Next slide, please. So this is what's there in practice. What's the problem here? So the problem obviously is interoperability, because actually if we assume to a certain degree what I said, that this is a dominant usage of CIF, a provider of a third-party CIF client has big trouble in supporting multiple different systems. Because if you would allow a more sophisticated CIF UI, you would risk to mess up with the way the CIF script is used in the vendor's actual UI. With the naming, the user could probably mess up with the special use stuff and so on. And dealing with deactivated rules, the same thing. It's also a portability issue, because scripts might also break if you just migrate from another system in the back end. And also you might need to consider that special use stuff might be handled in a different way between different systems. So one system might use vacation notices via CIF scripts, whereas a new system where the migration goes onto just do vacation notices in a totally different way. So if you now just copy over the CIF script, you actually end up having 2 different vacation notices on the same user, which is obviously not a desired behavior. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I hope the problem somehow became a little bit clear. So I think this is at least worthy, probably some informative description of what is there in the wild. So to inform at least clients about the forms of comments in scripts they might need to encounter and what to do about it. An open question is this should also probably have a normative dimension, like actually prescribing a certain pattern of comments or other ways, probably in the room, for doing comments, for doing this kind of deactivation, for maybe also defining something in the header script. So that's an open question for discussion now. Is this actually worth thinking about it? Also, what do you think about the overall thing, I think, because next slide. Yeah, we are basically done here. I think I said most of that already. Maybe last question here again is also observing that this dominant case actually supported by many webmail UIs is actually a very simple rule, CIF rule implementation, is actually CIF by itself. You know, the whole complexity of having totally nested rules, which is more complex to be implemented, is it something really required by everybody? Or would there be a use case for a CIF Lite probably or something like that? So I was just referred by Thunderbird people, there's a ticket in their ticket system where they basically deferred the implementation of CIF because it's just too complex. So one idea is also this is actually a barrier of adoption for Skim to a certain extent, and one of the reasons for the non-existence of more sophisticated CIF clients, because you know all these problems here might pop up in practice, and yeah, fixing it could probably, I don't know, help to get CIF a little bit more adoption.
Pete.
Thank you.
Hi, Pete Resnick. So I'll start by saying I think coming up with a document to start doing this would be a fabulous idea. It's a severe problem right now. It sounds like some sort of applicability statement implementation advice kind of document at some level, because it's not the protocol of Civ. It really is how you manage scripts when there are multiple scripts, what UIs are expected to support and not. One of the things that I've run into is if I've got a particular UI that handles Civ scripts, but the Civ script goes beyond the capabilities of that UI, and now I'm going to import it into that UI, I've got a real problem. So there's going to be a whole lot of tricky sort of user interface stuff discussed here. I'm not volunteering to write the document, but I think it would be a great thing to do. And some of this might need some rethink. I mean, using comments for certain things seems like a bad idea as the best practice for implementing certain features. So, multiple civs applied to different boxes and how to have them interact or mark them as inactive. I think there's lots of interesting ways to approach this. So all in support, but it's a big bite to take. So just very short comment. I think my personal goal is not to, do a big CIF rewrite, whatever kind of thing. My personal observation is the common thing, even if it might be hacky and bad, is something that works and is used. It even works for portability. We can do that across systems. And I wonder if people would anyway change their implementation to that extent. So I'm not sure if it's worth inventing something totally sound and fancy, but people won't use it anyway.
Yeah, I think there are, Alexei Malkov, there are two parts to it, right? There is a lot of recommendations how to do different bits, but there is also part about structured comments. And yes, it's a bit hacky, but every implementation I know of that has a UI had to do it. Our implementation did it. So if there is an agreement that let's all have this structure, if this part of comment has this structure, that might be rule name and rule type to help you extract extra information, I'll migrate to that, So yeah, it's probably the same document, but there is a bit of standardization bit. It's you can say it's a hack or not, but it's within the Civ syntax to use a structured comment. And then there is an implementation recommendation bit. So yeah, obviously we had this discussion a year ago. I like this document. I'm very glad that we're making some progress on this. So
thanks. Ken.
So Hans-Jörg mentioned that this might affect JMAP Civ, and I think this is outside the scope of JMAP Civ. Both it and Managed Civ just deal with moving whole scripts around, not individual rules. And I think that the comments, well, go ahead. I was going to say, while the comments are useful, I don't see how that affects what JMAP Civ is doing right now.
I'll explain to you. The difference between managed CIF and JMAP for CIF, as far as I got it, is in managed CIF you have a greeting. So this helps you to determine what is the source of this script. So if JMAP would expose a CIF script, I have no idea what the underlying system and dialect might be. So it might be fixed by adding either a top-level header that can state, okay, this is a script coming from Alexei's implementation or from whatever system, and on the other side, or it could be a greeting, like similarly like what Joris presented in the JMAP extension.
It's much more likely to be lost from the HTTP user agent, which is the place I would originally look for it, because of proxies in between. So it's likely that might not be available to you.
I guess my recommendation.
Request to stick it in the server info object.
Either that, I could. Probably.
Yeah, managed CIP had an implementation capability as part of the greeting that is basically what Hans-Georg is asking for, and I wouldn't have a problem adding something similar to the session object, knowing full well that some implementations may disable it because they don't want to advertise that kind of stuff. Same thing happens with IMAP greetings and all kinds of other stuff. But if there's no objection, I can certainly add that type of parameter to the object.
I mean, just to clarify, I think the case here is that one needs to see that probably nobody will use JMAP CIF for a native, JMAP CIF implementation, but there will be a legacy CIF underneath it anyway, right? Like a TIM CIF-D of Osiris or something like that, but could be another CIF implementation. And managed CIF would give you, theoretically, if it enables this greeting capability, but JMAP for CIF doesn't give you right now.
We're at time now. Thank you. So I think, Ken, you've got what you need from that.
Sure.
Thanks for the presentation. Do we have a call for adoption here, or is there something particularly you want at this stage, or is it just continued discussion?
I don't know. From my perspective, it could be a call. There is none yet, so it's for discussion basically, if it makes sense.
All right. So for discussion for now, and at some point you'll ask to have a draft adopted.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Arndt, did you want to say anything very quickly, since you weren't around before, on JMAP access, if people are happy to stay for a couple more minutes, and then we will be done.
Not really. I really would like to see a client implementation, but you knew that already. And I do want to say, Alexei, that was a great review.
You're welcome.
Cool. Alexei says you're welcome.
Any comments on thread ID would be welcome, of course, but the big thing, I feel that this should represent the needs of a client that wants to migrate to JMAP. But I feel icky about pushing it to RFC without any client inputs. And that's what I want to say.
As a server implementer, I would absolutely expect thread ID and message ID and mailbox ID to be the same, if but required to be present in IMAP and be the same in JMAP. That's the whole point, that you can access the same data in the same way. But that's because my server does that already, I guess. Anyway, we're at time. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for following us through this meandering thing. See you all in San Francisco. We didn't have time to go through all our milestones, but I've got a rough idea from the notes of what to do, so I will go through and update all the milestones later. Yeah, see you. Thanks.